So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our next panel that will be chaired by Charlotte McLean in Claupo, who will moderate our panel on learning differences. Very few people can claim the depth of experience and knowledge of disability-inclusive development around the world that Charlotte has. She has served as a human rights commissioner in South Africa and an advisor on disability and development for the United States Agency for International Development and the World Bank. She is the go-to person for issues from healthcare to infrastructure, but has a special passion for ensuring the right to quality education. And we are very honored to have her with us today to help facilitate this critical conversation. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that warm welcome, and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Charlotte McLean in Hlapo, and I'm the Global Disability Advisor at the World Bank Group. And I really am truly delighted to be able to moderate the session on learning difference, improving opportunities for children with diverse learning needs to participate fully in learning and in life. So this session, as I said, will explore both neurodiversity, disability, and human capital in the context of learning, and ultimately how we build inclusive societies in which we leave no one behind. So we know that globally, a disproportionate number of children with disabilities, migrant children, displaced children are not in school. And we also know that even when they are in school, they're often not learning. And so today, what we will do is hear about some of the advancements that have been made in the policy sphere. We will also hear about some of the lack of support that exists, some of the necessary accommodations that are needed, the issues around policy implementation that contribute to disabling learning. We will also hear about these constraints and some of the systemic barriers that Jonathan spoke about earlier this morning that keep children with disabilities from learning alongside their non-disabled peers, and understanding that it really varies across the globe. So again, I have the greatest privilege to moderate this fantastic panel of experts, and I'd like to get started with some questions. But before I do that, I would like to go, starting with Judy, and have you introduce yourself, your name, and where you come from, and just a little bit about yourself. So Judy, if you can hear me, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm not with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Okay. So I had polio in 1949. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, at a time when there weren't any pieces of legislation. So my experiences over the course of my life have been significantly focused in education advocacy, as well as disability rights advocacy in the United States and abroad. I have about 25 years of experience in nonprofits, and I worked in the Clinton and Obama administrations and also at the World Bank.
Thanks, Judy. That's a very modest introduction of yourself, but we'll let it be. Usha?
Hello everyone, I'm Usha Goswami and I'm Director of the Centre for Neuroscience in Education at the University of Cambridge in England. And I'm interested in individual differences in how children learn to read. Because when I trained as a primary school teacher, in my classroom I could see big differences in the way children approach the task of reading. And I became interested in the underlying reasons for those differences, which is why I'm trying to use neuroscience to look at the basis in the brain for the individual differences in the way children both require spoken language and then they acquire language when it's written down in reading.
Dennis.
Hi, I'm Dennis Wall. I'm Professor of Pediatrics and Biomedical Data Science here at Stanford. I'm very interested in identifying forms of autism and developing novel technologies to enable earlier detection and earlier activation of treatment for reasons related to the fact that treatment itself can, if delivered early, make very, very strong differences that are positive in children. And today, in this world that we live, we're not diagnosing early enough, and most kids are not receiving that kind of therapeutic benefit. So that's been a focus. I'll get into that when we go into the session.
Great. Elizabeth.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Kozlowski, and I direct the Learning Differences Initiative here in the Graduate School of Education, which is an investment from the Graduate School of Education in interdisciplinary research on children with learning differences. And I've had the incredible good fortune to be here while we hired 5 new faculty, all representing different kinds of expertise, from artificial intelligence to neuroscience, in our own initiative. And it has sparked incredible interdisciplinary thinking and also interdisciplinary research since we've been here in a number of venues. And the kinds of things that we're learning are embodied in the discussions that I've already heard today. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sina Skelton. I'm the Director of Operations for the Midwestern Plains Equity Assistance Center. We are one of 4 federally funded Equity Assistance Centers designed to work specifically with public K-12 education systems around issues of equity, ensuring that the civil rights of students are protected, and inclusive practices. Our specific center is located in Indianapolis University and Purdue University, Indianapolis. We work with a 13-state region, and we work with practitioners ranging from early childhood settings. So I was really interested in the panel just before us to post-secondary experiences. Very excited to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you.
So great, an absolute fantastic panel. And maybe to get started, I'll go straight to Judy. And Judy, if you could talk to us about, in your lifetime, how has the educational experience of children with disabilities evolved? That's the one part. And then the second part is, what are some of your hopes for the future? Looking forward, what are we looking for? What are you looking towards?
Thank you very much. Well, it's fair to say that in my lifetime, on the one hand, we've seen some very dramatic changes. Specifically that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, when I had polio, there was no right to education for disabled children. So in the United States at that point, when we finally got 2 pieces of legislation, one in 1973 called Section 504, which prohibits discrimination against someone who has a disability if the entity is getting money from the federal government. So that covered every aspect of education, plus many other areas. And then in 1975, with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So the passage of those pieces of legislation, as an example, I think were very important, because basically meant that the case had to be made that A, discrimination did exist against disabled people, we're talking right now in the area of education, and B, that the government under IDEA was committed to putting funding in and money into research and many other areas to help ensure that the reasons why state and local governments were saying they were not educating disabled children because of lack of funding would in part be removed. So we have seen in the US over these many decades that children are by and large in school, although I would argue that for poor and minority kids who have emotional disabilities, that the suspension expulsion rate is disproportionate. When we look at the issue of youth in juvenile facilities, a substantial number, 50 to 70% of the youth in those facilities have disabilities, have not been receiving appropriate educations. But we have parent organizations that have become much more influential and increasing funds at the federal level. And I would say universities do, many, not all, doing a better job on teacher training to ensure that we're producing a more qualified population of teachers to enter the classroom. Clearly, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 24, has been very, very important in elevating the discussion of education to countries all around the world, enabling the voices of disabled people who had experienced discrimination themselves and who are fighting for the right for children to receive education has very much benefited the overall discussion. But I think, as you were saying briefly earlier, Charlotte, for me, it is still pretty tragic that we have not seen, I think really in wealthier or poorer countries, the changes that I believe we should have been able to see at this point. And I think it's really because the commitment of education authorities to education of disabled children is still not where it needs to be. And there are too many families, there's still too much going on where there needs to be aggressive action on the part of families to be getting children the services that they have a right to. My hope for the future is that work like Elizabeth has been doing, thank you, Elizabeth, for everything that you do, which in my view is both identifying problems that continue to exist as well as moving forward at the university level to be doing more work to prepare a more educated population of people to work in the field of education. But I still too frequently am not hearing leading educators include the issue of education for disabled children in the same way that discussions are happening for other populations. And until that can really happen, we're not going to see the systemic changes that we need in any country.
Now, Judy, thank you very much for that. And we'll come back to you. Now I'd like to go to Usha. And Usha, we've heard a lot about neuroscience, the brain. How is this really changing the way we understand and how is it shaping responses to the variety of ways in which we can learn? If you could talk to us about that, that would be great.
Well, I think where neuroscience can make a big difference is in helping us understanding how differences in children's sensory systems cause differences in their cognitive systems. Because all the information that the baby and the young child is learning is coming through their senses. And those senses are helping build cognitive systems like language or memory or attention. So to give the example of my own work in literacy, when you're reading, you're processing speech when it's written down with a visual code. And it turns out to be individual differences in those speech processing skills that determine your learning trajectory, whether you end up with a learning difficulty so you can't read very well or whether you don't. And the sensory patterning in the speech signal that is important is to do with rhythm. So the research I've done suggests that children who are diagnosed with dyslexia in many different languages can't hear rhythm patterns in the speech signal very well. It doesn't mean they can't hear them at all, but it means if you have some, stress patterning like in words like Aladdin, hospital, these children aren't that clear where the middle stress syllable comes in Aladdin versus hospital, where it might be on the first syllable. And this means that the speech processing system that they develop is different from that of other children. It's a bit like being colourblind. It doesn't mean that you can't see, but it means that if every day at school you had to make decisions about red versus green, you wouldn't be performing as well as other children. So the neuroscience suggests that because this speech processing is impaired at the level of rhythm, partly because brain rhythms aren't synchronizing in time with these rhythm structures in language, the way to help these children is not by more and more training in phonics, but to go back to the foundation. The foundation of language is rhythm-based. We know that from baby talk. We know that from the kind of studies that Patricia Kuhl was talking about, that the more you talked with parentees, the better the learning. These kind of rhythms are harder for these children to learn, so it suggests that we need to emphasize and really have more routines to do with rhythmic language in the very early years to make every child able to access literacy. So I think what neuroscience can do is it can show you mechanisms that you maybe weren't aware of, Once you have the mechanism, it doesn't mean you need a neuroscientist in every school, but it means you know how to address through the curriculum or through parental practices how to enhance that child's trajectory, because that trajectory will go through the whole lifespan and enable your access to the rest of education.
Well, that's actually a great segue to Dennis's question, because Dennis, your research focuses on children with autism and children with developmental disabilities. What are you learning about how schools are adapting to better support children to learn differently?
Thank you. I'll start by describing some of the research that I do and how it impacts that question most directly. The work that we've been focused on is leveraging technology to the extent possible to enable artificial intelligence assisted diagnosis of children with autism as early as 18 months. The reason for this, I indicated in my intro, is that the average age of diagnosis for autism today is about 5. And so there's this large gap between when we can do it and when we should be doing it and when we are actually doing it. And that gap is important because there is this window of opportunity where educational programming, treatment programming can be very, very impactful for the children, to the point where 25% or more might progress to a level where they no longer qualify for an autism diagnosis. So that's motivated me in how we can move the window from where we are now to where we could be, where we potentially should be. And it turned out that the best way to do it is to try to capitalize on opportunities offered through ubiquitous devices, mobile phones, applications, and artificial intelligence. And it does a few things for us. It moves things outside of the clinical settings and into a more upstream location, maybe in the primary care, empowering physicians like pediatricians who don't particularly do this kind of work to be better at it, better suited for it, because they're seeing children in the well-child visits and can detect these opportunities to and act on these opportunities to diagnose the children. Diagnosis here gates access to reimbursement for behavioral therapy, and those behavioral therapies are a form of educational programming. A lot of that therapeutic programming takes the form of social interaction training, emotion recognition training, increased willingness to appreciate the salience of emotion and faces that children with autism tend not to have or tend to appreciate. Instead, maybe gravitate towards something that's asocial, like the solar system, with restricted and repetitive interests. It's difficult to extract them from. We figured out ways to move them from where they are after diagnosing, for example, using, again, technology, putting it in the hands of the parents, and actually speaking a little bit to the panel previously, and empowering moms and dads alike, other care providers, to participate almost unknowingly in this sort of educational evolution that's necessary in the earliest windows where it's possible, as children, for example, are moving from parallel play into peer play and beginning to understand their social world. With these kinds of interventions or treatments, we can actually create opportunities to teach children skills to thrive in those social environments. And again, it comes back to technology. I mean, very simple stuff. So Google Glasses, you might be familiar, is actually not dead. They still exist. You can still purchase them. And we've experimented with this augmented reality form factor in children as young as 3 years old, and they will wear these glasses. It's a very lightweight kind of augmented reality form factor with a prism, and it's just easy to ignore in minutes. And the outward-facing camera watches the world around them and helps them orient a face, appreciate a face, and the differences of the emotion in that face. And as a consequence of that, it unlocks these layers of the onion that enable them to grow and thrive on their own. Another simple example is, you're probably familiar with the Heads Up game by Ellen DeGeneres. Very, very fun. Played that with my own children and thought, well, maybe we could potentially turn, it's so fun, very pro-social, and creates this dyad between me and my son, or me and my daughter, that was so enriching. And we decided we'd try to do that for children with autism, to see if parents and child could come together, get excuses in 90 seconds, literally, of gameplay to talk about social emotion. And that ultimately pays dividends. So to give you an idea of what I mean by that as a clinician, as a person working in the clinical world, we are looking at endpoints that we must use to get things through the FDA, for example. And when we look at those endpoints using these systems, we're changing children in 6 weeks as much as they would realize those changes in 2 years of standard behavioral therapy. So really important, but what it means is that this interaction between parent and child in the home setting in a natural world might be significantly more effective for education here, where at this point treatment and education are synonyms for me. They mean the same thing.
Yeah, so fascinating. And I'm just, as you were talking, I was thinking, I was glad that you mentioned cell phones, because in the countries in which I work, it's really important to be able to have low-cost technologies that can be used. So that's really very interesting. Sinan, I come to you, and I come to you with 3 questions, or a threefold question. How do research and policy meet practice? And I think that's something that's come up from many of the discussions earlier today. If you could talk a bit about what are the barriers that you've encountered in promoting change, and how you've addressed them.
Thank you. And speaking of cell phones, I'm going to use mine. I have my notes on mine.
Use your cell
In a
phone.
way to make sure I want to stay on target. So when we talk about policy, research, and practice, for me, these are the 3 legs of a stool that really holds up our education system and can drive and sustain inclusive, effective education for all learners. The relationship is reciprocal. These 3 arenas, research is often used to inform policy, as we know, and we've discussed in earlier panels, and to justify policy decisions. Research also informs our educational practices that are promoted in our schools. Policy provides a parameter, the guardrails, if you will, for our practice, guiding how and what we do. And it is through practice, more specifically the research on those practices, that often ultimately makes its way into policy. It is cyclical and is mutually influencing cycle. I'm going to move to talking a little bit more about the barriers. When it comes to supporting inclusive practices and centering equity in educational systems, we must critically examine what is informing the research that is being conducted and taken up in our policies and informing our practices. Scholars such as Mary Pastis and Lee Patel discuss how today in schools, much of the information used to inform education discourse, priorities, policies, and practices is born out of a history of colonization, and specifically research originally designed and used to subjugate people from across the world. We must acknowledge this history and be aware of the legacy and the effects on research and educational improvement efforts today. For example, when we engage in research, educational research that stratify and segment students by characteristics or differences, and then deem some of them as normal, quote unquote, and some of them as at risk, and this usually happens along racialized lines, and the notions of what is normal or the notions of normalcy, and then design and test interventions to fix them. We are upholding systems built on the notion of white superiority and able-bodiedness. When we promote education research policies and practices that isolates on students' characteristics of differences without examining the marginalizing conditions in which minoritized youth are educated, we are consuming and applying research that leaves the system uninterrogated and thus limiting our focus on transformative change towards equity and inclusive practices. These are the barriers that we have to overcome, I think, when we think about policy, practices, and research. In my role at the Equity Center, we work with educators as partners and try to interrupt the traditional notion of technical assistance and work with practitioners to examine how we consume and engage research, practice, and policy. We blur the lines between policy and research and practice. We know, and as described by Sutton and Levinson's work, that often policy may not always reflect what is written in policy documents. But instead, policy is what is practiced. It's everyday, moment-to-moment interactions in our classrooms, in our schools, in our districts. We work to involve those who are most proximal to the implementation of research and policy, to be a part of the meaning-making process of research and making those policies a contextual fit. I can go on, but I see my time is up, so hopefully during the question we'll come back.
Some really important points there, Sina, and I think you kind of amplify the mantra of the disability movement that is nothing about us without us. And that really is important in terms of thinking about who's doing the research. And so that's a really important point that I think came through. So Elizabeth, if you could talk to us about how do schools, which are inclusive, benefit all children with learning differences? We've talked a lot today about universality, but how does it benefit all kids?
So in 2018, I wrapped up a research project in 3 states where we looked at a set of students with autism and other developmental disabilities who were put into 2 groups. One group was a group that received a very high quality literacy program taught in general education classrooms with typical kids. And the other group of students did business as usual as they had done in the previous 3 years of their schooling experience. And we assessed both sets of kids 5 times during the course of a school year on their literacy competence and their development. And we found that the group of students that was in general education classrooms with typical peers learning alongside them in literacy practices far outperformed the students who were in the business as usual setting in self-contained classrooms with only their own peers together. And that RCT, experimental design, that was funded by the U.S. Department of Ed, was one of the first big RCT studies that had been done with kids with really significant needs, kids that many people would say couldn't learn, were able to learn and learn fluently. We had a second component to this project, and that was to talk to the students who learned alongside of them and to talk to the teachers who were in the classrooms where we did this work, to find out what they felt about the experience of being there and what they learned from that experience. And we came away with some really big ideas about how important it is to create inclusive settings. The students, the typical peers that had welcomed the students with disabilities into their classroom said, so-and-so can learn. I just saw him learn. And when I did this, he even learned more. And there was a reciprocity and a relationship that was being developed between the typical kids and the kids that had up to that point not had those opportunities to be in that classroom. The teachers told us the same thing. They did not believe that these children could learn, and they thought that they were in a place where they were best positioned up to that point in a different classroom. What became clear in talking to so many people about what was going on is that the opportunity to see learning from the point of view of different people helps kids themselves understand their own learning better. They have definitions of learning. They can talk to their teachers about how learning might be set up, not only for the students that they were being asked about, but also for themselves. And the teachers themselves began to ask questions about what kinds of learning designs they might use in their classrooms to facilitate better and better instruction. The idea that Dan introduced at the beginning of this of this day is that when we move from a curriculum focus to a learning focus in classrooms, we expand the opportunity for everybody that's in that classroom to really learn and grow in profound ways. And that enhances our capacity as we move into adulthood to be much more accepting of the diversity of kids and adults who could learn and work side by side in communities. So that is a very profound and important, I think, learning that comes out of understanding and working with learning differences in classrooms.
Yeah, and perhaps it's not, it doesn't find itself enough in policy and research, that precise point, and I think that needs certainly to be amplified. Judy, I want to come back to you. And if you mentioned the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but generally, how do you think momentum is building in policy, advocacy, and educational circles?
I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think it goes without saying that the issue of educating children with disability is on most people's plate. And the CRPD, Article 24, certainly has been one of the major driving forces. I do believe, as I was saying earlier, that one of the big issues, and in some way Elizabeth was just discussing this, in what you were explaining, Elizabeth, you were saying that the teachers didn't believe these children could learn. And that, to me, is the fundamental problem. If we believe that a group of people, in this case disabled people, are unable to learn for whatever the reason, then having to convince people that they must bring these children into the classroom and that appropriate instructional training needs to occur, not just for the disabled children, but for the non-disabled children also, that we need to make that leap. And taking policy and putting into practice is what I see as many of our challenges. So the research that Elizabeth is discussing was funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. Question now is, how is that research being disseminated around the country? What is being done to help ensure that what we see clearly through this project is that children learn more effectively, their outcomes are significantly improved, and when you looked at their peer group that was in a different educational setting, their outcomes, I presume, Elizabeth, did not advance. They stayed stagnant like they had previously. How do we take the knowledge that we are gaining and apply it in countries around the world?
Right.
Because I think the research that you're discussing, Elizabeth, is really applicable in any country. So for me, it's not only the development of good policy, but how do we implement policy? How do we put appropriate funding to ensure that our teacher training schools are in fact ensuring that we are talking about all children? Because the data is out there. Disabled children in regular classes improve learning, non-disabled children benefit. There have been numerous different studies in this regard, but we still have not convinced people that this is the way it should be. Administrators at state and local levels, whether it's in the US or in another country, local school boards, who in many cases are resisting this. And we can see in countries like the US and others where some form of discussion is going on between family and educator about placement of children and services that children need to have, that still too frequently the intent of the policy is not being implemented. So, my words on this is that we need to really be insisting, not just in the disability community, but in the field of research and education in general, that when we talk about education, we're talking about all children in education. We're not talking about waiting until non-disabled children succeed in learning, and then we'll dip our toe into meaningfully including disabled kids. And we are still too much in the area where we are not requiring that all children are in the least restrictive environment.
Judy, thank you for that. I'm now going to open up for questions, and please come to the mic if you have any questions. I see a couple of people coming forward. Well, so a lot of the people coming forward are people that are the volunteers, but please, audience, come to the mic. Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Wang. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Education. Thank you for a very thought-provoking discussion. My question for our panelists is that the traditional special ed paradigm has viewed neurodiversity students as being this group that needs extra support and help. I want to go back to a point that made by Jonathan Rosa earlier this morning about the agency of this group of students, and the point made by Dr. Carol Dweck about how children's own beliefs about their ability matters in facilitating their learning. So my question is, how might we help these students understand their unique ability, their unique strengths and assets? And then how do we, through doing this, make them better advocates for their own needs?
Great question. I'm looking at the panel. Any
I can answer.
takers?
Sure.
Dennis, go for it.
I'll give you one example from our own experience in leveraging the Google Glass system with teenagers, not maybe the age demographic you're looking at, but a good one in the sense that this individual would wear the system. It's a very simple system that teaches emotion, Ekman emotions. She already really knew them, but she didn't have a great deal of confidence that she was reading them right in her friends. And the glasses gave her that confidence, and very shortly she took them off, and that was it. So the point there is simply that this ephemeral education that she received gave her this incredible confidence that the intuition she possessed was correct. And that was a great learning experience for her. Someone answering your question. Another part to the answer is just about the work that we do in the very early levels of developmental learning, especially in social peer interaction groups. Children are collaborative learners and can be collaborative learners, and they can do so with neurodiversity without labels. And it's that collaborative, label-free environment that, if we can encourage and foster more, will in the future create adults who already possess those skills.
Yeah, I think another important aspect, so in terms of the brain sciences, is that some of these processes that we're discovering are automatic processes that the brain engages. There's nothing to do with how hard the child is trying. So often when children struggle with literacy, there's this idea that they're just not trying hard enough, they need to do more drilling and so on. But actually it's quite empowering for the children in our studies to discover that this is just something your brain is doing a bit differently from everyone else's. So it's nothing intrinsic to your learning abilities, it's to do with how your brain is working. So from the point of view of the child then, they feel in some sense better about themselves because it's not their fault. So that it's down then to the curriculum and to the teachers to be bringing forward that child in the right ways, rather than that it's the child's lack of application.
I'll add to that, and connecting to what you just said in terms of understanding and recognizing that people are different, their brains can function differently. And it's not so much so that how we can support students in understanding that, but it's really how can we support the educators in understanding that, right? And then creating learning environments and spaces that acknowledge that validates that was responsive to those differences. And seeing difference is not something to be remediated or something to be cured or something to be worked out of, but really acknowledging that it's different and we can create curricula that is responsive to those differences, that appreciates those differences, and continue to validate and support and empower our students to be themselves and to navigate the world in the way that they navigate the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. Judy, I know that you want to come in on this one, please.
Yeah, I want to say that I want to continue on what you were just saying, and that is that a disabled child from the age of 3, 4, and 5 who is in a segregated class and being taught on a day-to-day basis that they are not equal, it's not their responsibility. They are learning that they are different, and they are learning that they are negatively different. That paradigm has got to change so that those children see themselves as equal students with others. Then, like other students, they're learning about who they are, respecting their differences, and being able to advocate for themselves. But programs where children are either not in school or are in segregated classes or minimally in regular classes, it is very difficult for those children to be able to develop this self-esteem that they need, because they're likewise being treated this way in the broader community. So the burden should not be put on the students. The burden needs to be put on the educational system.
Yeah, point well taken, Judy, on that. And I'd like to go to a question that's come virtually. And the question is, are there effective strategies for getting research into the hands of policymakers to create more effective policies? Now, many of you on the panel work in the sphere of research. Any ideas around that? I'm looking at you, Elizabeth.
Well, there are a lot of things that we need to do. One of them is to believe in the power of education for policymakers. That these dialogues about the structures that exist, the data that we already have about the effects of the system of education that we have, that was born out of people trying to fit the model of education that they understood when 94-142, the original Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed. School districts created structures in order to get to actually install the things they needed to install to be in compliance with the law. The name of the game continues to be in compliance with the law. A huge percentage of funding here in California goes to the legal costs of families having to advocate for services for their students through the legal system in order to basically ask for accommodations and modifications to the structures that we have, when what we could do is to learn what we know, to use what we know from the learning sciences about design, to design schools that actually fit the paradigms that we've been talking about on this stage. And in order to do that, we need to have active, engaged dialogue with policymakers. We need lots more opportunity for pilot programs to be set up so we can demonstrate the efficacy at scale of the kinds of things that we're talking about. California has 43 million people in it. It's a huge economic power in the world. It has the capacity to do some of these kinds of things. And for us to learn with them, us meaning researchers, to learn with practitioners and policymakers about how to build schools that actually work for the students that we have now. And I think it's time for us to do that.
Can I say, I also think some of the points were made this morning are very relevant to this question, because policymakers need to take account of the data. It's often very hard to get the policymakers to look at the data, because I think it was Tricia this morning said they already know what they think should be taught, or they already know what they think should be learned. But we need to have an evidence-based education system where data counts when you're making policy. I think that's a really important point.
I mean, I think it is a really important point, but I feel like very often data on children with disabilities is not being collected, right? At least in many of the countries in which I work. And so there needs to be an emphasis on collecting that data. Judy, just hold on a second. I want to come to Dennis and I'll come back to you in a sec.
I'll try to answer this question from the medical perspective and from my own experiences. We constructed this artificial intelligence system for aiding diagnosis of autism, and actually have been testing it in Bangladesh. It's a system that actually has great promise to be equitable across diversity of all kinds. And we have generated the data. In fact, we decided we'd go through the FDA for regulatory approval. It's the first ever of any kind, any autism diagnostic of any kind to go through that FDA approval path, not let alone the fact that it's software as a medical device. And we thought, okay, this is important because it passes the medal of peer review that will make it possible for policymakers to adopt and for insurance, Medicaid, to adopt it and pay for it because it's so important that it's available to everyone. But that's really hard. And we're fighting with it right now. Getting state Medicaid to cover this has been amazingly and for me eye-openingly challenging. There is a hope that, of course, we'll get there, but it's an education on our part and on the part of the Medicaid programs to become comfortable with this kind of approach to diagnostic assessments of children with autism. And so I'll just say that's an evolution, and it's, I think, a education again about what this means and what technology can do, affordable technology here, and why it's worth supporting on Medicaid. That's the point that I want to make.
Judy, you've worked on policy a lot. Do you want to come in on this?
Well, I wanted to ask Elizabeth a question. Elizabeth, with the research that you were just discussing, as well as other research, are you able to use the university and their education program to work actually in schools in your area to take what you've researched and put it into practice?
Yes. Earlier today, we learned about research practice partnerships that are being used at Stanford in relationship with local school districts to build communities of practice around research and to use that evidence base to inform practice in those spaces. We have a partnership that's emerging in a school district now where we'll have a full campus, preschool through 12th grade, 3 different schools on the same campus where we can do a lot of this innovation and bring our Stanford teacher education program teacher candidates there to engage in this kind of practice. It will be very powerful, I think. But I think that these efforts are not unique to Stanford. We have examples of this around the country where people have done these very well articulated, high quality evidence-based interventions, and they don't really sustain. I don't think we have the scaling up strategies in place that feed all of the policymakers along the way and also connect the various systems together to actually make the cultural shift that we're talking about in our education system. I think we're on the cusp of that, but I think that's something that we're particularly well poised to do, but I don't think we've cracked that problem yet.
Right, but at least you're on the road for this. And I think this level of discussion is very important for the future because it's really taking research which has been proven to produce certain outcomes and looking at it, as Elizabeth is saying, with an objective of scaling up, moving it from a good practice to a best practice to scaling up. And if you're able to apply something like this, again, right now for a minute, we can talk about the US. The diversity of learning in the United States is such that if something like this can be applied in multiple school districts, then I think it's essential to being able to convince not just policymakers, but legislators who are going to be allocating the money to do the research, take the research to practice, etc.
Yeah. So we have somebody in the audience who'd like to ask a question. Please come to the mic.
Hi, my name is Jenna Ellis. First of all, thank you so much for putting this panel together. We have learned so much from you already, and I just wanted to say thank you. Our disability advocates have done a lot to get our kids with learning differences in the gen ed classrooms, and they've done a really good job of that. And now, thanks to research like yours, we know that it's beneficial to include those children in the classroom and beneficial for all of the students in the classroom. With that in the back of your mind, what could we do to better support or prepare our gen ed teachers to make these inclusive efforts more successful?
That is a great question. Anybody wants to start? Sina?
Sure, I'll take that. I'll kick it off anyway. I look to my fellow panelists to build on. So I would think about going back to the question of research. What counts as research? And who are we looking to as sort of experts about learning, about supporting students with disabilities? I would suggest that we shift from the idea of research on students, research on communities, to research with our educators, with our students, to engage participatory action research paradigms and methodologies, to blur the lines between research and practice so that we're actually engaging in both at the same time. And when you have those who are more proximal to actually implementing the research, right? Actually implementing policy as the designer of the research, as the co-creators of the research questions or inquiry process, then they're more likely, I think, to engage in research that's really reflective of their context, and educators will create learning environments that's inclusive for students. I think we face challenges when we try to sort of replicate and duplicate a intervention study that was done in one area and try to wholesale place it in another context without engaging those educators in that context. That's when we went into trouble. And so there's this tension between sort of the fidelity and contextual fit, but we won't have to really worry about trying to make that contextual fit if we are engaging with our teachers, with our educators on ideas, innovations, interventions that are contextually based, that they are a part of design and engaging in the research study themselves. And so I will offer that rather than how do we help educators become more inclusive, our general educators to become more inclusive, I would suggest that we engage our general educators in the process of looking at this system, their systems, their classrooms, their schools, along with and collaborating with their special education partners and students to figure out together how do we make our learning spaces more inclusive, more responsive, more reflective of the differences that's within our schools, our schoolhouses, and classrooms.
So, I would add to that, Sina, that I think it's really important to not only work with communities, but also ensure that persons with disabilities are also educators, researchers, policymakers. I think that that lived experience becomes an important asset in addressing this issue. So just wanted to make that point. I think we have a couple more hands in the audience. Please come to the mic. And I see Brett over there, so.
Thanks. Fantastic insights from the panel. I mean, invariably the question about how we, the discussion, the debate between research and policy seems to shift always to the idea that policymakers either, as some of the panelists were saying, need more data. Now, policymakers don't often read data. They depend on advisors to mediate data, and they will take what is necessary for the political climate at the time, and they can actually read data in different ways depending on the regime, the government in power at the time. So I don't think more data is necessarily the question. But really my question is, are we really arguing for a better dialogue between research and policymakers, where policymakers make policy in order to enable us to do what we want to do? Or is the argument really an insistence that policymakers enable us and fund the space in which more innovation in what we do, and the fantastic innovations from all the panelists I've heard, and it seems to me that a space, an environment that enables innovation is more important than the idea that research might somehow encourage policymakers to make a policy of some description. And I just wanted some clarity, really, about some sort of refinement of what it is we are really asking for. If we are asking for policymakers to lead by making policy on questions that we are not entirely always sure of, depending on the political climate, or are we asking for more space for innovation, a better environment to enable us to do more research and actually to drive what we do know by innovations and more discussion?
But innovation has to be based on expertise, doesn't it? So what I meant about data is we have knowledge. We've acquired a lot of knowledge as a discipline. This knowledge means that the way you want to innovate might change. So from the case of my dyslexia work, it would mean that you don't just drill synthetic phonics day after day for a child who hasn't got that foundation of their speech rhythms. And so to me, the answer is that knowledge always matters and expertise always matters. And even for the previous question, if teachers understand the basics of how the brain learns, for example, language, then in their own space, in their own classroom, when they see a child not performing as they might expect, they have tools, they have knowledge that can help them to innovate because they know what the possible mechanisms that are going wrong might be. So I think the issue for policymakers is that we do have expertise and it's relevant to them making policy. Research isn't something separate that just has got nothing to do with policy. The whole point of doing education research is to try to improve the end state for these children in these classrooms who aren't necessarily getting what they need. I think someone said this morning that if we just made policy to pick up that child who is never responding, is never being helped, all children would benefit, and I think that's really true. I do think expertise matters. That's what the research is trying to deliver.
I'm sorry. I love what you're saying. Teachers need knowledge, but then they have to practice with that knowledge. The knowledge itself is the kernel of an idea that has to be acted out and engaged in with students to hone and refine that knowledge base for a particular kid or group of kids. And if we have the innovation space that policymakers could help us create, we would be able to create schools that are true learning organizations in which teachers themselves are participants in the way that Sina's talking about as co-researchers to refine and develop a practice that we can actually have time to talk about together when we're in practice settings so that teachers could learn from one another and from their students and from the families that are there to support it. But the innovation zones that we have right now actually make it very difficult to innovate outside the sleeve of the curriculum that is informing what teachers are asked to do. Teachers could be agents in a very powerful way, and I think we need some support to reframe the sphere of practice and to elevate what it means to be a teacher and a learner at the same time. I mean, that's the joy of teaching, is when you take all the tools that you have and you are with some learners and you go, what do they really need and what do I know that could help them learn? And how can I facilitate that and how can they help me understand it better?
Judy, you're nodding. Do you want to come in on this? You're mute.
No, I was agreeing with what Elizabeth was saying. Learning environments are critically important, and I believe that policy is not intended to say what you have to do from 1 minute to the next. Policy in many ways is really, in the area of education for disabled kids, is you're wanting to look at outcomes. Are kids in school? Are they in the least restrictive environment? Are they performing like other children? Are they getting the support that they need, etc.? So if we're showing, like in the study, this one study that Elizabeth was discussing, improved outcomes as a result of children being in classrooms, I presume, Elizabeth, that in selecting, did you randomly select the classes or the classrooms, or did teachers have to agree with that they would participate?
Well, teachers did have to agree to participate, but we randomly selected the schools.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you had a willing audience, which is great.
Yeah.
And when we look at issues around policy and education for disabled children, we are looking for outcomes. And I think that's in part what we're saying more broadly. The outcomes for disabled children are still not where they need to be. And in my view, they're not where they need to be yet because of a lack of commitment on the part of the educational structures that all children, including disabled children, have a right to quality equal education. And so a lot of what we're still doing is fighting to get kids in a regular lunchroom because they're in segregated classes, even though research like Elizabeth and others are doing clearly shows that this is not the way for these children to learn, and probably is also showing that teachers are not gratified by the work that they're doing also, because in one set of classes, kids are learning, in the other set, they're not.
So Dennis, do you want to opine on this? And then we'll go for the last
I'll be
question.
really quick,
Please.
I think. I just really love the question because I think the levels of data necessary for the different tiers of, let's say, approval and bringing something into a scalable level of impact vary. So the lobbyist for Medicaid needs something different from the director of Medicaid needs something different from the FDA. So coming back to looking through the lens of one part of the continuum of neurodiversity, autism, we know, and this is somewhat unfortunate, that the diagnosis gates access to reimbursement for the treatment. The treatment is tantamount to education. We want to get through that, and we need Medicaid to get through that. And so there is a HCPCS code, an HCPCS code, a CMS code for digital therapies, pioneered and now available, and potentially an opportunity for, if it's accepted, innovations to come quickly on the heels of what we're trying to do, to get this covered under this code by Medicaid so that all kids can have access to this, affordably. And if that happens, if we can learn how to speak the language at the level and with the data that they need, we can set the stage for innovations like ours to come quickly on the heels and really change the ability to leverage these new ideas.
Great. We have a last question from the audience.
Hello, Leonard Medlock with the Stanford Graduate School of Education Alumni Board. And my question is straightforward around how should we be talking about learning differences? In other words, what's the common definition if I wanted to have a conversation with my coworkers, my colleagues, with funders, venture capitalists, philanthropists, policymakers, researchers? What is the language, seeing as we've expanded from learning disabilities, which I think is less broad and less inclusive, like how do we talk about it in everyday conversation? And the underlying tension, of course, is I think in practice, and what I've heard a lot of and what I agree with is we want to treat all students as unique but equally capable. But when it comes to advocating for support or resources, we have to figure out the right box to check in order to get that advocacy or those resources. So what is the common language we use just to have more discussions around this?
Okay, some ideas around common language. And then
What about personalised learning? Because really these learning differences mean every child needs personalised learning in some sense. That could be something you say to the equity capitalists.
Great. I know we're running out of time, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to take any more questions from the audience, but I did have a question to the panelists to wrap up. One thing you'd like to see happening to build an inclusive learning future, just very briefly, I'll start with Judy. Briefly, Judy. You're on mute.
Commitment and belief that it's possible.
Perfect. Usha.
Yeah, I think learning environments are the key. The more we understand about the brain and what it needs to learn well, the better learning environments we can create.
Dennis.
Collaboration. I think collaborative learning and really building off of what I already said, inspiration that the innovations you make will scale, can reach the population. And I'll say, just from my own experience, when you use digital, you can reach more people. And so embracing technology and games, again, for children, they want to play games. You can make a very big difference, and it can create incredible innovations that are very empathic, very diversity aware. And so I'm trying to encourage more students to do that.
Wonderful. Elizabeth, what would you look for?
Everything. I think we need education leaders in every school that embrace this vision, and we need to help them shift how teachers think of themselves and the work that they do, from being conveyors of a curriculum and seeing themselves as something as folks that deliver something, to people who are themselves engaged in the process of learning about learning with every single group of students that shows up in front of them. We need that.
Great. Sina.
An appreciation, valuing, and honoring of difference, right? And then our education system responding to that. That we're throwing away this idea of the normal child, the normal body, the normal way of being and doing, and instead embracing that the only thing that's normal is that we're all different. Mm-hmm. And if we create environments that's acknowledging of that, that's responsive to that values and appreciate that, I think then everything that we've been talking about can come to fruition. But as long as we're trying to make children, families, people fit in this narrow idea of what's normal, then we're not going to realize the vision that we've been articulating throughout this conference here.
And I think if I was to say, I would say that inclusive education, a recognition that inclusive education benefits everyone. And I think that's a really important shift that we need to move towards. So I think you'll all agree this has been an amazing panel. We haven't answered all the questions, but we'll find a way to do that. So thank you all very much, and thank you to an amazing panel. Thanks, Judy, for joining.